partner about 13, 14 years ago. And I was mainly doing virtualization deployments back then. So I did a lot of installations and configurations. They had been doing that for a year and a half or something like that. And I started doing some blogging. And back then, there were only a few bloggers, people like Scott Lowe, Michelle Leverick. There's literally a handful of bloggers right there that were fairly active. And I was just getting started. Chat Sackage was getting started around the same time. And all of a sudden, I received an email from a recruiter from VMware, and they said, we would be very interested in talking to you. Apparently, someone who worked for VMware as a consultant had seen some of my material, and it solved some of the problems that they were facing at a customer side. So they said, we might consider talking to the guy. We have a position open, so maybe he's interested in joining. At the same time, funny enough, I also received an email from Chad Sackage from EMC, or Dell EMC, and nowadays who works for VMware as well. And he drops me this email stating that he had an issue in his lab, and he solved the problem using my blog article. And I'm reading the email, and the email states Chad Sackage. I'd never heard about the guy before, by the way. So I'm reading this email. It says Chad Sackage, Vice President of EMC. Like, why on earth would the Vice President of EMC reach out to me? I thought someone was, making a joke. But, in short, he was starting up the vSpecialist team back then, and I had two options. To join another company. That was Dell EMC, or EMC back then, as the first vSpecialist in Europe. And the other option was to join VMware. Now, I had a long conversation with Chad, and he mentioned that there was going to be an extreme amount of travel involved. I was going to be the first vSpecialist in Europe, which meant that I would be, in Russia on Monday, Germany on Tuesday, Holland on Wednesday, France on Friday. And I said, well, I'm not sure if I'm too interested in just moving around countries constantly. The VMware offer was very similar from a role perspective to what I was already doing. It was a consultancy role, so I decided to join VMware as a senior consultant. And the first year, I primarily spent the majority of my time doing health checks, troubleshooting, basically an extension of VMware support services at larger customers. Customers like, for instance, Shell, ING, Philips, the larger Dutch customers, but they also operate worldwide. As a result, as you can imagine, because I was constantly doing all of this troubleshooting, I was gathering not only a lot more knowledge, but the nice thing for me was I was also gathering a lot of content for my blog. So I started to put out a lot more information about things that were happening in the field, issues with upgrades, issues with snapshots or backups. And around that time, there were also a lot of challenges around things like vSphere HA, for instance. And that's when I started documenting some of those concepts around, what is HA, how does it work? You had this master-slave or primary, secondary concept back then. So I started to include that as well. And I started to, write more and more about, what was part of the product back then. As a result, my name started popping up internally more frequently. And at some point, I noticed that the technical marketing team published a white paper, which was a deep dive on vSphere HA. And I was reading the content, and I recognized a lot of the content. Basically, what they did is they leveraged my blog post, and they copied and pasted my blog post in their Word document, and they published that as an article after rewriting some of the bits and pieces, looking to, I don't care, but it would be nice to at least, be credited in the white paper. So they added my name to the white paper, and then after, I don't know, a while, probably a year or so, the guy was responsible for vSphere HA ended up leaving the technical marketing team. He went to a different company, and his manager still knew about the fact that he was leveraging my material to produce material. So he ended up contacting me, and that's how I ended up joining the technical marketing, and I became responsible for vSphere HA. And then after that, I had a number of different responsibilities within the different technical marketing teams. So I started off with HA, then was responsible for things like DRS, vMotion, storage vMotion, storage IO control, storage DRS, became responsible for storage completely. And then in the end, the last role within technical marketing, I was responsible for the whole SDDC suite. So basically telling the story around vSphere, Site Recovery Manager, vCloud Director, all of the networking components, basically anything that we have available today as part of our product suite. Now, the interesting thing back then that happened in our organization is that the technical market team split up. A part of the team remained doing technical marketing, and another part of the team became what we are referring to today as customer zero or integration engineering. Basically, the first customer within VMware actually testing the products, but then not from a Q&A perspective, so not quality assurance or quality engineering, but purely testing it from an operational standpoint. Can I actually install it? Can I upgrade it? What happens when I deploy a virtual machine? What happens when I delete a virtual machine? What happens if I make these changes? Or what happens if a host fails? And I ended up joining that team after a while as well, simply because I had done various different things within tech marketing, and I just wanted to do something new. So I ended up joining that integration engineering team. And after that, something interesting happened. The market started to shift towards a different type of infrastructure technology, which is called hyperconverged infrastructures. And out had solved certain problems, or I needed to do a write-up from an architectural perspective, do a design, whatever it is. So a lot of that content could also be reused, of course, without mentioning any customer specifics, because usually those need to remain anonymous. But a lot of that content I could, reuse. Another thing that helped me a lot in the early days is that I had 2 young children, and they would wake me up really early. So they would wake me up around 4:30, and I had challenges going back to bed. So I would just sit there and basically end up, spending a lot of time on the community forums, answering questions, reading white papers, and then writing about those things that I read or that I've answered again. So, in one way, I was fortunate that my kids didn't sleep a lot, but on the other hand, I think it was also a matter of setting certain priorities. I knew what I wanted to do within the company, and I also knew where I wanted to go towards. And in order to get there, I also realized that the only way to get there, if you don't live in Palo Alto, right, like all of us, if you're in Palo Alto, moving to a certain position is much easier when you don't live in Palo Alto. Because when you're in Palo Alto, you can walk into someone's office. You walk up to someone, you have a conversation, so you see them occasionally. When you don't live in Palo Alto, like all of us, it's going to be very challenging to get your name out there constantly. So the only thing that you can do is come up with, I wouldn't call it a marketing plan, but at least have a strategy to ensure that people not only know you are, but also ensure that you provide valuable feedback. So one of the rules that I've always had is when I contact an engineer or when I contact a product manager, I not only will be asking questions, but I also aim to provide them some kind of insight around what customers are doing, or provide them feedback around what is working and what isn't working, so that it actually remains a two-way street. Because if you don't have the opportunity to walk up to someone and actually have those conversations on a regular basis, they also need to see the value in spending time on communicating with you. If they don't see any value, they probably wouldn't even reply to your email. So it's about being smart in terms of not only creating content and reusing content, but on the other hand, also, being smart around how you communicate with other people within the community, but also within the company that you work for. Everyone needs to get something out of it, at least in my opinion. That's the way you get to elevate yourself and hopefully, stand out of the crowd. Because, when you work for a company like VMware, as most of you know, there's over 30,000 people, I think, right now within the company. So there's a lot of people that are trying to make, are trying to stand out. So, it takes a significant amount of effort.
Yeah, definitely. It makes sense. I mean, you need to have a face when you are marketing yourself, and that is a mandatory thing in a career. So, Duncan, how now moving to some technical parts of the conversation, how do you see, I mean, you have been evangelist for vSAN and VMware face for vSAN for the last few years. So how do you see, I mean, vSAN or SCI as a future technology?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you look at where we are coming from, right? vSAN had the beta in 2013, the first release in 2014. It was a primary, a platform back then that was used by customers for test and dev. Since then, it has grown immense. With 7.0, we introduced things like file services, and before that, we introduced, things like stretch clusters, encryption, deduplication, and compression, and there's many different features that we've added or have been adding over the past couple of years. And if you look at what we have been working on or what we are moving towards, I think HCI is going to be the primary platform that customers will be leveraging in the upcoming years. If you look at our customer base today, just to give you guys an understanding of how many customers we have about 500,000 customers right now from a vSphere perspective, right? If you look at vSAN, the latest number that was announced was above 20,000 customers. So from a percentage perspective, it's still a relatively low number, right? Of course, we have competitors out there. We have Nutanix, we have HP, NetApp. There are many different solutions out there from an HCI perspective that customers can use today, and we're starting to see that more and more customers are actually moving towards that. And the reason for it is fairly straightforward. It's because of the simplicity and the cost involved. The upfront cost from a HCI standpoint, if you compare it to a three-tier architecture, makes HCI very relevant for the majority of customers. And I think if you look at it today, the majority of customers are using HCI primarily for their traditional workloads. What we are starting to see right now is that a lot of customers are also moving towards HCI, not just for their traditional workloads, but also for their cloud-native workloads. So they're using it as a cloud-native storage platform. We have customers using vSAN, for instance, as the platform for all of their artificial intelligence and machine learning efforts, which is a very interesting thing that is happening in my opinion, because it's a very specific type of solution that runs on top of the infrastructure. And then, of course, if you look at the platform itself, we just released file services. In vSphere itself, we released Lifecycle Manager, which I think is a huge feature for customers, not just for HCI customers, but for vSphere customers itself. But from a vSAN standpoint, there are many different things that we can still add on top of the current layer. You can imagine that over time, we could potentially add a object storage platform, something like S3 capable on top of vSAN, so that developers can directly access an S3 bucket that is hosted by vSAN. You can imagine that over time, we would potentially release other types of file services protocols as well. Besides NFS, we may also be releasing something additionally on top of that. Other efforts that we're, for instance, doing or working on right now that was discussed at the last VMworld are machine learning and artificial intelligence solutions that actually tap into the HCI infrastructure and try to optimize your HCI infrastructure based on the workloads that you are running, and based on the machine learning algorithms and the outcome of those algorithms. So there are many different things. What I think, first of all, vSAN and vSphere or HCI in general can still expand and extend. But I also think there's many different opportunities out there for different types of workloads where we can still grow extensively.
Yeah, definitely. We have seen, I think, vSAN AI or something is out recently. So we are seeing that moving in that direction. So Duncan, one more thing, like if we go to traditional organization where larger organization, smaller are quickly adopting SCI, they are ready to do it. And where enterprise architect, while designing their infrastructure, they still prefer SAN and try to keep it decoupled from their existing compute infrastructure. So how do you see that will change in future, and what will be your advice that you will give to them, because we have so many architecture?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and I think it's a challenge. So first of all, I understand why it happens. I used to be a consultant as well, and I used to be responsible. I used to work for an insurance company, and I was the administrator for the virtualization platform as well as for the storage platform. And if there's one thing that everyone tries to avoid, it's change, right? Because whenever you introduce a change in your environment, there's typically a risk associated with it, and most people will prefer to avoid any risk. So that is one of the reasons the adoption in enterprises is typically slower than it is in the mid-sized market. Having said that, from a vSAN perspective, we do have very large customers leveraging vSAN. We have customers that have multiple petabytes worth of data sitting on top of vSAN clusters. We have customers that have over 8,000 hosts licensed, running in production, with vSAN, running workloads on top of those environments, literally with tens of thousands of VMs in those environments. So one of the things that I always tell customers, and I tell architects as well, first of all, I'm not here to convince anyone that you should be doing vSAN or you shouldn't be doing vSAN. You need to be doing that what actually works for your workload and for your company. If you, however, feel that from an operational perspective or from a financial standpoint, a solution like vSAN makes sense, the answer is usually yes, by the way, then what I would typically recommend customers is to start off with something like a management cluster or a demilitarized zone. Start off small, get acquainted with the solution. So you install vSAN in a management cluster, especially those larger environments out there, they typically have a management cluster. So you start out small, you get acquainted with the solution, you make sure that you understand how policy-based management works for virtual machines. And then after you get used to it, you start to figure out if there are any additional projects that could potentially benefit from these solutions, right? Typically what we end up seeing happening in especially the enterprise customers is when they start off with a management cluster, a new project comes in, let's say for a new cloud native deployment, they need to run Cassandra somewhere with multiple other components, applications running against Cassandra. So what they do is they create a small new cluster and they enable vSAN for that as well. Or they have this VDI project and they figured, you know what, I don't want to get the VDI desktops running on top of my storage platform. I'll just create a separate cluster for that. Same with the demilitarized zone. What we're starting to see is that a lot of customers are creating these fully isolated clusters for their DMZ specifically, from a networking and security perspective, leveraging NSX, and then from a storage point of view, they will end up using something like vSAN because it makes or it ensures them that even if there's a denial of service attack, it can't impact their the other workloads, right? When they have everything contained within the same environment. So start off slow, start off with one cluster, then expand it to 2 or 3, depending on the project that are coming up, and then as soon as you start seeing the value, consider moving towards vSAN completely. However, I also have customers who say, okay, I have a particular workload. Today, vSAN is not suitable for it. So I'm going to remain running that workload on this particular storage system. And I'm okay with that as well, because as long as it works for you as a customer, as long as you are a happy customer, that also makes me happy from a VMware point of view. I think that is the most important things, right? And before anyone asks a question, what was that particular workload that wouldn't run on vSAN? I was talking to a customer, and they had these. It was a hospital, and they have an imaging system. And these guys are creating terabytes worth of data every single day. They are storing multiple petabytes worth of data, but the application is only 4 virtual machines. Those 4 virtual machines in that particular case run on 2 hosts. because it provides them HA. So they said, well, maybe we can move to vSAN. Well, if you need to move to vSAN, we will need to start buying 32 terabyte flash devices. Just imagine one of those flash devices failing. So in that particular case, you're better off using a storage system which was purposely designed for running this type of workload, right? So they were running a storage system at that particular site that was designed for storing images specifically. So it makes a lot of sense to use it in that particular case. So depending on the workload, you may either you do want to move or you may not want to move.
Yeah, definitely. It's according to customer case. One more use cases which I found is a DR setup for smaller organization. Because of the turnaround time, you can just simply use vSAN and get it done in a day or so. So
yeah, so one thing to mention, you probably have all seen this, is that recently we announced the acquisition of Datrium. I agree, vSAN is a great solution for a secondary site. We have a lot of customers doing that, and they replicate the data from the primary site using vSphere replication to their secondary location, or they could use something like a recover point. Recently, for those who are not aware, we actually acquired another company called Datrium, and Datrium has disaster recovery as a service solution, where you're actually able to replicate your data from on-premises into something like VMware Cloud on AWS. And you can also replicate to AWS S3, which gives a really cheap solution for customers who don't necessarily have a second location. They can now replicate to S3. And then when they need to recover, you can actually instantiate that SDDC within VMware Cloud on AWS and recover the data from S3 into that SDDC that you just created within VMware Cloud and AWS. So talking about DR, I think that's one of those, interesting solutions that you will start hearing more about probably around VMware timeframe.
So we have questions collaborated from community. I would hand over to Vishwajit for his questions which he have collaborated.
Hi, Duncan. So now with this customers and enterprise customer now moving to the cloud, and definitely if we were moving to cloud, you have to choose private cloud, a public cloud, or in a hybrid cloud segment, right? And there's a lot of option available in the market, like AWS, Azure, and Google. And how VMware is partnership is working with this players. How did VMware shape itself with these cloud players? So that's we like to know.
Yeah, I think those are very interesting solutions. So there is it's probably good to explain what has happened over the last couple of years for those who are not aware. So first of all, we have many different cloud partners. It's not just Google, Microsoft, and AWS. We have around 5,000 different cloud partners worldwide. Basically, in every single customer or in every single country out there, we have multiple cloud partners. These cloud partners are called VCPP, so VMware Certified Cloud Partner Program. And they typically run some type of vSphere-based solution and enable customers to actually leverage those environments. So we have many different cloud partners out there. Now, of course, everyone has heard about these hyperscaler cloud solutions out there, and the hyperscaler cloud solutions out there being Google, AWS, and of course, Microsoft. Now, the very first announcement that we did was around the partnership with AWS. With AWS, what we have done is slightly different than what we have done over the past 12 months with Microsoft and Google. With AWS, what we've done is we've created this joint collaboration program where we have two engineering teams actually jointly working on a single solution. So basically, our engineering team is working closely with the AWS engineering team to ensure that we can leverage their data center from a hardware perspective to deploy our services within their data center. But it's VMware who's responsible for deploying vSphere. It's VMware who's responsible for deploying NSX. It's VMware who's responsible for upgrading and managing these hosts as well. So it's a slightly different solution than we have with AWS or that we have with Microsoft, with Azure, as well as Google GCP, because with Google GCP and with Microsoft Azure, what we actually have done is we've provided them a framework, and they are leveraging the framework to provide those services, so the vSphere services, to their customers. So it's slightly different. Google and Microsoft are responsible themselves for upgrading and maintaining those systems. So from that point of view, it's slightly different. However, from a customer experience, the great thing, in my opinion, is that these solutions are all more or less based on the VMware Cloud Foundation platform. That's what ties all of these solutions together, and that is also what allows customers to move workloads, if they would like to, using something like HCX between these different clouds. And I was recently talking to one of the guys who was part of the HCX team, and he was telling me that we have multiple customers who actually consume different cloud environments out there and move workloads based on the cost of those particular type of workloads on that platform at that point in time, which is a very interesting solution. And we also have them moving from environment to environment based on the type of services that they would like to consume. So you can imagine that they are specifically, writing software for a particular AWS service, but they may also be writing software for a particular Google service if they're doing something with ML and AI framework, which is probably what Google is best at this point in time. If you compare all of the different cloud platforms out there, then it makes sense to have your workload running or an eval in any way close to that particular aspect of Google as much as possible. So many different things happening. Like I said, all of them are based on the VCF platform. So from that perspective, they are very similar. They're only different in terms of how they are being managed on the backside of things. So you as a customer wouldn't be involved in that. But the Google platform is a very interesting platform, to be honest. I was surprised to see what they've been capable of doing themselves without our help.
Yeah. Okay, so then we continue with the same topic. I think we touching on the container part, and we know how it is rapidly evolving, and how the application are developing, shipped and build and shipped. It's completely different the way we see the monolithic apps. And with vSphere 7, VMware also support the native container. So how this vSAN piece now integrated with this containerization, how the customer is going to benefit from that?
Yeah, I mean, so over the last couple of years, I've been talking to a lot of customers, and it's very interesting to see what has been happening. Frank Denneman, Cormac, and I have been doing a lot of the VMUGs, as we've already been talking about before we got started. And during those VMUGs, I try to talk to many different types of customers, smaller customers, larger customers. And the interesting thing is that 3 years ago, when I would ask the question, is anyone doing anything with containers? One hand would go up in a room of 200 people. 2 years ago, it would be 4 hands, right? Last year, it was 10 hands. Today, it's going to be 20 or 25. The numbers are growing pretty fast. And if you ask those customers, what is the challenge that you are facing as an administrator? The answer is pretty straightforward. What we are starting to see in a lot of environments is that developers are requesting extremely large VMs. What they are doing within those virtual machines, we don't really know, but we suspect that they are doing something with container technology. So they are deploying these really large virtual machines, and then they are probably installing and configuring Kubernetes within these virtual machines, and then they are scheduling their containers across those virtual machines. The problem, of course, with it is that the administrator has no clue what is running within those virtual machines, and is not really capable of providing any services that would help the developers consuming those types of platforms in an easier way. So what we've introduced in vSphere 7, which was released through VMware Cloud Foundation, is the ability to instantiate a Kubernetes cluster in a fully automated fashion on top of vSphere itself, and then have your developers actually consuming that Kubernetes cluster. So it avoids the need for a developer to deploy Kubernetes themselves, manage Kubernetes themselves. That can all happen within the platform. And the interesting thing, of course, is because we also have cloud native storage integration, and of course we are also considering building additional services on top of that. You can imagine that it becomes a lot easier for the developers to deploy these new applications and say, okay, I would like to deploy this particular application with an X amount of storage, and it needs to be protected against an X amount of failures, right? All of that will happen through the vSphere layer and through our cloud native storage control plane. And all of that can happen not only automatically through the power of Kubernetes, but also without the administrator actually getting involved, but still be aware of what is happening in their environment, because we're also building that integration within the platform. So within the platform, the administrator can actually see, the virtualization administrator can actually see what is happening. Are they actually using Kubernetes? Are they using persistent volumes to store data on? Where are those persistent volumes being stored? Do I need to back up those persistent volumes? All of those different capabilities are exposed to the administrator. So, I think by providing this platform within vSphere, it not only makes the life of the administrator a lot easier. Going forward, it will also make the life of the developer a lot easier, because they are not responsible anymore for deploying those services themselves.
Yeah.
Okay, so Duncan, as we are talking about vSphere, and now we all know that vSphere has been our first love, and we all know vSphere from the books or the blogs, which pretty much everybody of us have read about. So from a vSphere 7 point of view, we would like to know that since it has been a biggest evolution of vSphere over the past decade, so how HADRS was re-architected in vSphere 7, considering that now we have to run a virtual machine alongside the containers? Because there are a few things which are available, but there's a lot of information which hasn't been blogged or documented about. So anything you want to elaborate on that part?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. If you look at it from a vSphere perspective, right, HA hasn't really evolved with vSphere 7.0. There isn't really a lot that was added from a HA perspective. From a DRS perspective, we did make a lot of changes. So HA, there were a couple of minor things that we've added. They weren't really relevant to the container space, but for DRS, we did have to introduce a lot of changes from a container point of view. First of all, I think the most primary thing is that we've changed the whole algorithm. And for those who have been running vSphere for a while, you know that DRS runs every 5 minutes. But starting vSphere 7, DRS actually runs every minute. Now, for those who have been running DRS for a while, have been using DRS for a while, we also know that it was quite challenging for vCenter to run DRS every 5 minutes. So what's going to happen when you run it every minute? Well, that is one of the reasons we had to introduce a different algorithm, and we had to change the architecture from a DRS standpoint as well to ensure that we can actually run it more frequently. Why are we running it more frequently? Well, basically because these types of workloads that are now being instantiated on top of vSphere are, of course, a different type of workload, like container workloads, right? These container workloads there could be new container workloads popping up every 5 seconds. So balancing every 5 minutes probably wouldn't make sense. So that's why we made that a major change from a DRS standpoint. The other thing that I think was interesting from a DRS perspective is that we introduced a concept called scalable shares. We've probably all used resource pools before, and resource pools basically provide you a mechanism to group virtual machines. And I know some customers have been using resource pools as folders and didn't really understand that a resource pool assigns resources to the virtual machines within that pool as well. Now, the challenge with that is the following. If you have a resource pool called high and a resource pool called normal, and you set a number of shares on that resource pool as well equal to high and normal, the number of VMs that run within that resource pool will determine how much resources each of those virtual machines will get. If you look at it as a pizza or a pie, right, whether you're carving up that pie between 8 people or between 500 people will make a big difference. Now, if you have a small pie and you need to carve it up with 5 people, you still get a relative, a nice piece. If you have a very large pie, but you need to carve it up between 1,000 people, you still get a really tiny piece. So what we introduced in vSphere 7.0 is the ability to enable what we called scalable shares. And scalable shares will take the priority that you assign to the resource pool into account. But on top of that, it will also take the number of VMs into account as well. So if you have a resource pool that has a priority assigned of high and it has 500 VMs, and you have a resource pool that has a priority of low, but it only has 5 VMs, those 5 VMs will get less resources than the resource pool high would get, or the VMs within the resource pool high would get, even despite the fact that it has 500 VMs. But only, of course, when you have scalable shares enabled. So that is something that we've introduced as part of DRS as well. The other thing which I think is interesting that we've introduced is the UI is slightly different because we changed the algorithm. We are also introducing what we are referring to as a DRS score. And the DRS score basically informs you about how happy, the happiness level of your virtual machines. And the happiness level refers to the amount of resources the VMs are requesting and the amount of resources they are actually getting from the cluster. And the thing where this will actually help is with the balancing of the cluster itself. So if a virtual machine or multiple virtual machines are unhappy, of course, every single minute, DRS will try to figure out how to ensure that that particular virtual machine is happy. In the past, DRS, although it did focus on happiness of the virtual machine, it also focused a lot on an equal balance within the environment. What you will notice going forward is DRS is going to be slightly more aggressive towards that happiness aspect of the virtual machine itself. So, I think that is a great improvement from a DRS standpoint. But, for customers, the biggest change is definitely that it will be running every single minute instead of every 5 minutes.
No, that's going to be a really game changer thing for DRS per se. So, Duncan, we all know that in last couple of months, you were also involved in artificial intelligence and machine learning views, and you're doing a lot of things, right? So we, from a VMware point of view, know that you are under your Take 3 program where you were taking a break and working in a different view. But from a community point of view, we get to know from your blog that you have done some significant amount of work, and taking that knowledge out from that different segment, which may be a little new for you also. Will we see some future investments in vSAN and vSphere where it will be leveraging artificial intelligence and machine learning? We know that in vSphere there is a few things where Bitfusion and the partners come into the picture, but will it be going forward AI and machine learning platform if we call vSphere from vSAN point of view?
Yeah, I mean, we already have multiple customers leveraging vSAN or HCI in general as a platform for machine learning. Just to give an example, there's a large cancer research institute in the Netherlands who actually leverages vSAN across multiple locations as their primary platform for machine learning. So what they actually created is they created this large cluster, and this cluster is geographically dispersed. So they have 2 different locations for this particular environment, and they are running their desktops for their employees during the day. But what they are doing is they are running machine learning exercises during the night, or artificial intelligence exercises during the night, because there is no one around, or there's hardly anyone around to consume the virtual desktop resources. So they leverage their GPUs during the night as well as during the day. So we've already seen that happening. As you mentioned, with Bitfusion, I'm pretty sure that is going to happen more often. We have a lot of customers that have a lot of infrastructure which is not really well consumed overnight. And what I can see definitely happening is that is a space where vSAN can come into play, especially because vSAN already has capabilities from which AI ML could benefit. One of those examples being is that vSAN actually provides you the ability to specify how many copies of the data you would like to retain locally or distribute across the cluster. You can imagine that if you're doing an artificial intelligence exercise, that data is probably going to be stored somewhere. So why would we store it in a redundant way on top of vSAN, an additional time? we can leverage the vSAN capabilities to specify that that data doesn't need to be, protected against failures because we already have it available redundant. So, yeah, definitely going forward, there will be different efforts where we will ensure that those types of workloads will run smoother. And the other thing to mention is I did my Take 3, and I worked a lot with GPUs during my Take 3, and I think one of the interesting things that I learned is that although there was a lot of material out there already, it seemed that not a lot of people actually know a lot about using GPUs in combination with vSphere in a standard way. Yeah, there's a lot of people from the BitFusion aspect that understand BitFusion, but then just using GPUs directly against virtual machines for ML and AI is not something that we've seen too often. And I discovered that when I was adding multiple GPUs to a single virtual machine, because the documentation that we had out there, I now have it fixed, but the documentation that we had out there didn't actually list all of the requirements, and the mechanism that they specified in order to get it running was incorrect as well. So during my Take 3, I also had the pleasure of getting the documentation fixed. And one interesting thing is that a lot of people didn't realize is, and I didn't realize it either, by the way, but if you have a GPU or a vGPU assigned, so a virtual GPU assigned to a virtual machine, and you want to migrate the virtual machine, so vMotion the virtual machine from one host to the other, the amount of downtime associated with that can be significant. Now, the reason for that is pretty straightforward. I had never thought about this, right? A vGPU has memory associated with it. Now, when we do a storage vMotion, or when we do a vMotion, right, we do a live copy of the memory. And we try to sync that up on a regular basis. And at some point in time, there's only going to be a few megabytes left. We stun the virtual machine. So we pause the virtual machine. We copy those pages. We move the virtual machine over. We unstun the virtual machine. Typically, that happens in under a second, potentially even milliseconds. However, when you have a vGPU associated with your virtual machine, your vGPU may have 8 gigs worth of memory associated with it. Those 8 gigs of memory, or those 16 gigs of memory, or whatever it ends up being, are not copied by the vMotion process. They are copied during stun time. So when your virtual machine pauses, now what I saw happening when I was testing is it starts copying all of those pages, and when it's done copying, it unstuns the virtual machine. So, if you have 8 gigs of memory, that could take, 30 seconds, 40 seconds that virtual machine is being paused. So yeah, I ran into some interesting things, and those are definitely problems that I think we as a company, together with companies like NVIDIA, will need to solve before customers can actually leverage it in a very efficient way.
I think we're grateful you did that experiment during your Take 3 and not a customer has actually faced it. Otherwise, it could have been into a different representation. Okay, so Duncan, one thing which we all personally thought would like to ask you is we know you as an active contributor to community through your blogs, through your public speaking. You're always reachable, and you represent a BU. You're a CTOA. But nowadays, since we all follow your blog, we also know that you're involved into a initiative called Kidspire Vietnam. So how do you see community as a driving force in tech, and how does this initiative come into the picture? How did you get associated with it?
Yeah, that's a good question. It started out a while ago. I think it's probably 6 or 7 years ago. VMware internally has this program where we enable people to do some type of volunteering work. Besides doing volunteering work, so you can spend 40 hours a year doing volunteering work while you're actually being paid for VMware for a local nonprofit organization. Now, I was being asked by VMware to go on this trip and help a organization called Kidspire in Vietnam, and help them with the deployment of multiple classrooms in these orphanages, so that they can actually teach these orphans within these orphanages that things about technology. So how to use the internet, how to learn binary counting, stuff like that. All random things. Do some coding or what have you. And when I was asked to go there, and I joined that trip, and I started engaging with these people, and we deployed the labs, and we started talking to some of these kids, and I got a better understanding of what some of the challenges were that they had. I also realized one thing is that if you compare my situation, right, and probably your situation as well, to those kids in the orphanage, and I looked at how happy they were with going to school, which I can tell you my kids aren't always happy that they need to go to a class. These kids, they were waiting in line, they were jumping up and down so they could go into this classroom and learn about technology. It was really cool to see. So one of the things I did back then 6-7 years ago is I decided to personally make a donation to the company. I asked a few friends to do something similar, and we raised a significant amount of money, and they were capable of deploying one of those labs. Then a month ago, I was actually with VMware for 12 years. Now, when you're with VMware for 12 years, VMware actually gives you $3,000 to donate to charity. 3,000, something, 3,040, whatever it ends up being. So I decided to reach out to Kidspire. I asked them, I said, are you guys planning on doing a lab refresh? What would the lab refresh cost? So they came back to me and said, well, we're actually planning on doing a full lab refresh across multiple classrooms in multiple orphanages. So they have about 6-7 orphanages that they support. And I found out that they need to have about 15 laptops or Chromebooks per orphan or per orphanage. So the cost was around $3,300, $3,400 US dollars. So I figured, with the $3,000 that I already have, plus a small donation from my side, I will be able to make sure that these kids actually have a full classroom. Then I figured, what I can also do is reach out to the community and see if people want to contribute. So I started this fundraising campaign on GoFundMe, and then we have an internal VMware link as well. And I decided to blog about that. And I was very surprised about the results. Over 7,000 additional US dollars were raised. So I think it's nearing $11,000 right now, which means that they can fully replace more than 3 classrooms. We're talking about 45 laptops, 45 new Chromebooks for these kids. And I think that is something truly unique. Yeah. And just to be sure that people understand, we had some crazy donations, right? I had people donating $500, right? Which I was very surprised about, because that's a massive amount for anyone. Yep. But we also have people donating $5, and to me it makes no difference whether you donate $5 or $500, because it fully depends on what you're comfortable with and what you can miss. And anyone that's capable of giving these kids some kind of second chance, or chance to make something of themselves, and potentially move into the world of IT, I think that is great. So it's definitely something that surprised me, and it was good to see that the whole community came together and was able to support the effort. It's still open, by the way, so if people would like to chime in, feel free to donate any amount. The details you can find on my blog, yellow-bricks.com. If you feel obliged, it was amazing. And to be honest, it in one way it surprised me, but on the other hand, knowing a lot of the people in the community, it didn't surprise me either. I've seen this happening before, when people got into trouble in some shape or form. People get ill. Some people don't have an insurance or whatever it is. And I've seen this happening across the board, where the community chimes in, whether it's through doing a donation or simply by retweeting it or posting it on LinkedIn, right? That also helps. Even if you can't afford it, by simply retweeting the message, maybe someone else can afford it. So that is, I think that is something that is huge. So the other thing, which I think is great, talking about community, is events like this, right? Not just me talking here, but if you go to a regular VMUG event, one of the customers actually coming up to the event, presenting about what he's been doing in his environment, talking about the challenges that they are facing. I think that is something that is truly unique about the VMware community. A lot of communities are fairly, closed. They don't really share what they are doing. And the funny thing is that the VMware community is fairly open. If you go to the community forums, so the VMware community forums, the VMTN, there is hundreds of new questions there every day. There's thousands of people answering questions on a weekly basis. If you go to Twitter and you ask a question and you tag the V experts, pretty sure someone will respond within 10 minutes, right? That could be a random person, in Switzerland, but it could also be Cormac Hogan who spotted the question, who figured out, what, I know the answer, so I'm going to answer the question, which I think is amazing. I think that is something that is really cool about the community. Everyone is, willing to help each other.
Yep. So that's really great and inspirational as well, Duncan. So in fact, if I give you the example from our community, so we started in 2018. So unfortunately, we didn't realize the day we are planning to organize our first VMUG event. It's a procession day in our place, and it's a very auspicious day where people carry their gods from one place to another place, and the whole road is blocked. I mean, there are instructions from the municipal corporation not to drive on those routes during those days. And when we have announced our event and we realized that we have announced on the same day, and we were all scared that whether we will receive support or whether people will turn up or not. But we are so thankful for our community. People actually took their time, and it was on a Saturday, by the way. So people took their time. They started little early from their home so that they can reach the venue. So we did that in our VMware office. And it was amazing, and we were expecting even if 20 people would turn up, it will be a great event. And fortunately, we have more than 40-45 people in our first event, and that was surprising. And the number is growing ever since. So, yeah, I completely relate to your statement that community is definitely a driving force, not just in a VMUG event, but any community for that matter, whether it is a technical community or not. So, Duncan, we are almost done with our questions. So I just want to end it with one statement, which I have been receiving from people that you should ask Duncan. That since your story has been very inspirational, right? So I received some chats over the this webcast that it's very inspirational story, and we hear a lot from what Duncan has shared about this story. So what key tips will you share with people who embark on this journey? For the techies or architects of the world, what message will you give them, that what makes a difference or what makes them a great architect from a good architect?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It is a question that I've received multiple times. First of all, I think the most important thing is communication. It doesn't matter where you work. It doesn't really matter, which team you're part of, but communication is crucial everywhere, always. So I've always been very open. Sometimes I may have been too honest for, certain cultures. But, I've always tried to communicate. I always try to explain why certain things were happening, why I was responding in a particular way, why customers had certain problems, how we could solve particular issues, where market opportunities were. And I think in the end, that is something that a lot of people will appreciate. Now, talking about communication, I think the other thing that is really important for those who are planning or are trying to make a career move and would like to become, a technical marketing architect or like to work for a company like VMware, I think presenting, doing public speaking is very important. It's also very challenging. So for those who don't know, I used to be terrified of public speaking. When I was in high school, I would not do any speaking at all, right? I would not get in front of the class. Now you can imagine that when you work for a company like VMware and you get asked to do the very first presentation, it's going to be very scary. But in order to grow within the company, right, there are certain things that you need to overcome. And for me, that was probably the most challenging thing I've done in my life. So I was very uncomfortable. But I also knew I had to do it in order to get to that next level. And that is the other thing that I would like to stress to people, right? I know it's not easy, but make sure that you're uncomfortable on a regular basis. You don't want to get into that panic zone, right, where you don't know what to do anymore or where you need to start and how to progress. But as you guys mentioned, I recently did this Take 3 program where I started looking into technology, which I did not know anything about. And the reason I did that is because I wanted to learn new things. I wanted to be uncomfortable again. I wanted to be forced to understand why people were doing certain things, how other communities worked, and what was happening in a particular space. And you're going to be uncomfortable doing that, and it may not be the easiest thing, but I'm pretty sure that after 2 weeks or after 3 weeks of being very uncomfortable, you will notice that that uncomfortable feeling isn't there anymore, and you start to get a better understanding of what it is, and you actually start to realize that it wasn't as bad as you would expect it to be. And that usually, then ends up resulting in some form of growth, not only from a personal perspective, but potentially even from a career standpoint, right? For me personally, when I took that Take 3 effort, I knew that from a career point of view, it probably wouldn't help, much. It's not like I felt there was a career opportunity in that space. But I did know that from a technology standpoint, I was get acquainted with all of these different new type of technologies, or at least technologies for me that I wasn't used to working with. So I was getting a lot out of that, which now also allows me, to talk to you guys about these different types of things, and also with customers. So it provides you a broader perspective. So, in order to grow, in my opinion, there are 2 key things, as I mentioned. Communication is the very first thing that you need to make sure that you're good at. And then the second thing that is part of communication as well is the public speaking. Make sure you end up doing that. And VMUG is a great effort, so make sure to join the VMUG and give a presentation. And then last but not least, make sure you're uncomfortable on a regular basis, because that is the time where you actually end up learning new things. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah,
It is.
yeah, it did. Over to you, Uday.
Thank you, Siddharth. Wow, I mean, a lot of fantastic discussion within last 30-40 minutes of time. So on behalf of entire VMware community, we would like to thank you, Duncan, for your valuable time with us. It was, indeed a great, pleasure conversation, and we got to know so many different topics today. Just within 40-45 minutes of time, we covered many verticals like vSAN, we covered vSphere 7, the cloud native storage, SCI, and it's really amazing. Within a very short span of time, within a very small gathering, completely remote, we covered a lot of things. It's really fantastic. And more importantly, we also come to know where the technology is moving forward in the future. So we would also like to thank our elite sponsor, Commvault, without whom this event wouldn't have been possible. Now we are moving to our next segment, which is one of your favorite, which is vSAN quiz. And we would love to have you join us for this quiz session as well. But if you have something already planned in place, then you're free to dock off if you need.